Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. As we continue with Part 5, Prophecy Day and the Great Pyramid of a Long Civilization's Trail, an account of recent experiences in mystic places and strange lands, by Ralph M. Lewis, KRC, an article taken from Rosicrucian Digest, Volume 15, Number 5, June 1937. A Long Civilization's Trail by Ralph M. Lewis, KRC. Editor's note. This is the 5th episode of a narrative by the Supreme Secretary relating the experiences he and his party had in visiting mystic shrines and places in Europe and the ancient world. Prophecy Day and the Great Pyramid. Though an extremely inviting breakfast had been prepared for us, we were not in a mood for the consideration of food. What lay ahead of us occupied our thoughts. All through our travels, there had been in the back of our consciousness the thought of the Great Pyramid and September 16, 1936, the eventful day prophesied by the pyramid itself to have a tremendous future effect upon the races of mankind and our present civilization. Even as we hurriedly ate and glanced through a Cairo newspaper, we observed that the press of that city had taken cognizance of September 16th and, in a long article, quoted different authorities' interpretations of the symbolism of the Great Pyramid with respect to this particular day. Sheikh Abdul, our personal guide, called for us in a modern automobile of American make in which we placed our various cinema equipment, tripod, camera, accessories, lens, films, filters, and then crowded ourselves in as well. We were soon speeding toward the Great Pyramids. Of course, from what one has read and pictures one has seen, one realizes that the pyramids are the greatest edifices ever built by ancient man, as far as we now have knowledge of the past, and that they are massive structures today, even in comparison with the skyscrapers and big buildings of our modern cities. But this realization is nothing to the actual experience of seeing them. As one approaches, they grow monstrous and seem to loom out of the very sands upon which they are erected. Most paintings of the Great Pyramids make them seem very colorful, yet in the glaring sun, even in the early morning, to the eye they are white with just a slight tint of yellow. They reflect the brilliant sunlight on the sands. The pyramids are built on a great high plateau, the plateau of the Sahara. They are not on the delta region of the Nile. In a sense, in their present state of preservation, they appear crude, like an enormous pile of gigantic blocks tumbled upon each other and assuming, it seems, by accident the general shape of the pyramid. But this impression is only gained when one is close to them. From a position close to them, there seems to be little difference in size between the Great Pyramid of Cheops and the Pyramid of Chephren. As one starts to walk about the base of the Cheops pyramid, there soon dawns upon him the realization that it does, as estimated, cover an area of some 13 acres. The great sandstone blocks of which it is composed are about the shoulder height of an average man. For a height of about 50 or 60 feet around the entire pyramid, the great blocks are quite jagged and protrude. Above that, with the exception of the one corner or side of the pyramid which is exposed towards the open desert, the sides are quite smooth and almost inaccessible. The exposed corner, however, has been whipped by the elements and the sands for years, and it is so jagged that its blocks form a natural stairway or steps to the apex. It would seem as though it would be quite simple to ascend the pyramid by this means, yet to the inexperienced it is a tedious task. Native Arab boys for a few piastres willingly race to the top and return in the short time of 7 minutes. The top of the Great Pyramid is now flat, but originally had a gold apex, portions of which were removed at different intervals in the past. It is said that the remainder of the gold was removed during Napoleon's invasion of Egypt. In fact, from below one can see a slender mast rising from the top. This steel mast, it is said, was affixed to the top of the Great Pyramid by Napoleon, and from it flew the French flag during his occupation of Egypt. One of the mysteries of the Great Pyramid for a considerable time, even in late centuries, was the location of its entrance. There was nothing visible from the outside to indicate the proper entrance to it. The Caliph, El Mamun, made a false entrance, and this false entrance is still used today as the main entrance to the pyramid. It was through this false entrance that we made our entry, climbing up to it over 2 or 3 of the large blocks, each weighing 2.5 tons, which is the average weight of all of them, and of which there are some 2,300,000 in the Great Pyramid. enough to form a stone wall from New York to San Francisco and halfway back, 4 feet in height. We entered the jagged aperture of the mammoth structure, and then our party of 4 cautiously walked along a semi-dark and narrow stone passageway, which led to the ramp of what is known as the Grand Gallery. After walking along this passageway for a short distance, we were obliged to stoop and crawl through a circular-like tunnel for a distance of about 25 or 30 feet. When we stood erect again, we were at the beginning of the Grand Gallery. It was a most awe-inspiring spectacle. We thrilled to the thought as we looked upward along this steep, narrow passageway and saw above us and on either side massive, highly polished limestone blocks that we were in the Great Pyramid of Egypt. Mystery of mysteries. One feels helpless, surrounded by this wall of stone. He feels insignificant, humble. It is peculiar but true that the Great Pyramid inspires in man that same feeling of humility as do some of the great works of nature. Slowly we began our ascent up the rough stone ridges in the form of steps, which are the only means of reaching the top of the Grand Gallery. It is a steep ascent, and you feel, after 5 or 10 minutes of climbing, that the height of the Great Pyramid is underestimated and certainly must exceed by several hundred feet the nearly 500 feet accredited to it. Suddenly your attention is called to an almost obscure hole-like aperture to your right as you ascend. As you look at it, it seems as though it was not an intentional opening, but perhaps the result of damage in later years. But you are advised that this is the true entrance to the Great Pyramid. As you peer into the inky blackness and feel a cool draft of air upon your face, you think of the hundreds of neophytes of the mystery schools of the past who were led up from the chamber of darkness below after taking their original obligation at the altar between the paws of the Sphinx, and after having performed certain rites in the allegorical world of darkness depicted by the lower chamber. They were then permitted to ascend the very narrow and low passageway into which we looked, and to enter the Great Pyramid itself through this jagged opening. How pleasing it must have been to them to know that they had attained that degree of illumination and understanding and worthiness which permitted them to travel further physically, mentally, and spiritually. So with the most solemn spirit and in utter silence, we proceeded. The entire experience invited silence. Ordinary conversation and comments would have seemed so absurd, so meaningless in contrast to the thought that was put into this stupendous structure. The wealth of knowledge it represented, the experiences of those who had gone before us in this same place. Finally, with gratitude, we came to a rest at a level stage. Walking along this level pathway, which was considerably more narrow than the Grand Gallery, we entered a portal, an opening seemingly cut through a sheer block of limestone of about 7 feet in height and 3 feet in width. Passing through this, we came into a large chamber known as the Queen's Chamber, about 25 feet in length and 16 or 20 feet in width, with a comparatively low ceiling, absolutely plain, no inscriptions, no symbolism, nothing to indicate either the life or death of its builders. It must be explained at this point that the prophecies of the Great Pyramid are not based mainly upon inscriptions found on the walls or in papyrus scrolls, for there was practically nothing left or found in the Great Pyramid to reveal anything of the times of the pyramid itself, or of the future which the pyramid prophesies. The prognostications are based upon the dimensions and the arrangement of the dimensions of the Great Pyramid, its passageways, their height, length, and breadth, the height of the pyramid, length and breadth of the stones, the distances from one passageway to another. There is a numerical uniformity to the dimensions, and this uniformity has given mathematicians, scientists, and others a mathematical key. And with this key, the different proportions and mathematical arrangements of the Great Pyramid have been used to reveal events of the future. This is not merely speculative or fantastic, because the events have definitely come to pass, one after another. It is one more indication of the fact that the Great Pyramid was used not only as a temple of learning, but as a monument of learning to inform future generations of the knowledge of the basic sciences had by the mystery schools at that time. Other facts are that the pyramid is in the exact center of the land surface of the earth. The fact that the weight of the pyramid is the same as the weight of the earth in proportion to its size, and further, that it was used as an astronomical observatory, showing knowledge of astronomy. Any engineer knows that the builders of the Great Pyramid must have been possessed of exceptional engineering skill and ingenuity to build the structure. Its great blocks of stone are perfectly mathematically proportioned. Their ends are fitted together so perfectly and held by such a thin and yet exceptionally adhesive mortar that not even a sheet of paper can be inserted between them. They were hewn out so accurately that each block of stone does not vary from a straight line and an accurate square more than 1/100th of an inch in a length of 6 feet. After leaving the Queen's chamber, we returned to the Grand Gallery once again and continued our ascent for a few minutes longer. Except for the feeble torch-like light every 15 or 20 feet, fastened by metal brackets to the smooth stone sides in recent times, the passageway would have been inky black. Finally, the uneven flooring, which really consists of stone blocks of which the pyramid itself is built with niches to keep one from slipping because of the steep incline, leveled out, and a few feet ahead of us it appeared as though the passageway, with the walls converging to a width of about 4 feet, was blocked by a huge stone, one of the masonry blocks upended. As we went up to it, we noticed that there had been carved through it also a tunnel-like passageway, the deeper shadow of the entrance not having been noticeable further back. The height of this tunnel-like passageway was not sufficient to allow us to walk erect, and we were again obliged to crawl on hands and knees. We crawled a length of about 16 feet, then stood upright in a large chamber, the height of which was about 12 or 14 feet, length about 30 feet, width about 20 feet. This was the king's chamber, known as the Hall of Illumination. It, too, was perfectly bare of all furnishings, inscriptions, hieroglyphics. In fact, everything with the exception that at the end, opposite from which we entered, was a large sarcophagus of stone. The sarcophagus, in fact, was one of the blocks of masonry of which the Great Pyramid is constructed, and it was lying in a horizontal position in the center of the end of the chamber. The upper portion of the block had been sawed or cut away, and the remainder had been hollowed out to conform to the general contour of the human body, and thus it formed the sarcophagus or coffin of some pharaoh or eminent person, so relate the sagas. Many believe it was the burial place of the pharaoh Cheops. However, there is nothing in the sarcophagus at this time, nothing inscribed upon it that would confirm this theory, and there never has been found anything that would definitely establish the fact that the Great Pyramid was built solely as a burial place, with this tomb room as its final purpose. One immediately gains the impression, which supports legends, that have come down through the ages, as well as the more recent discoveries of which we will speak later, that this sarcophagus was used for initiation. In this Hall of Illumination, this king's chamber, there met at intervals only the highest adepts and the most highly developed and learned of the members of this mystery school, this early Egyptian brotherhood of learning. It was in this king's chamber that the council meetings were held, where policies were decided upon which shaped the course of many human lives at that time. It was in this chamber that all the facts of reality, all the knowledge which man had acquired by virtue of experience and investigation, were classified and related and made into an understandable, livable philosophy of life. In the lower chambers, the students were taught facts, the result of inquiry and investigation, made to prove the laws, made to apply them to their own lives. And as they learned these lessons, they advanced, degree by degree, chamber by chamber, until eventually they were permitted to share in the council meetings of the Hall of Illumination. And from there, they went forth in the world to spread the knowledge they had learned, to gather about them other neophytes whom they sought out, and to teach them as they had been taught. All around this great temple of learning, this pyramid at that time, greed, fear, avarice, ignorance, and superstition prevailed. These dual conditions have always existed. The learned men of that time, those who had attained the Hall of Illumination, could not go out among the multitudes and immediately convert them to understanding. They would only have lost their lives if they had attempted it, and nothing would have been gained. So the real purpose of the Great Pyramid was kept secret. To many at that time it was considered merely a place of worship, where mysterious religious rites took place, and the ambassadors of light and wisdom of that period were forced to seek here and there one who was ready or worthy to take the vows at the altar between the paws of the Sphinx at a certain hour at night, and then be led through the secret passageway discovered in recent time by Selim Hassam, eminent archaeologist, to have led into the Great Pyramid itself. We stood about, none of us speaking, just thinking, each within the world of his own thoughts, trying to visualize what had occurred in this very stone chamber, in this heart of a past civilization centuries ago. There also flashed through our minds the fact that many occult and mystical organizations, so proclaiming themselves, had prophesied a dire event for the world upon this very day, September 16th, 1936. They had contended that it meant, if not the end of the world, a serious catastrophe which would shatter civilization, that it would mean the ruination of humanity, or perhaps the very atoms of the Great Pyramid itself would fly asunder. We recalled, all of us, to ourselves articles we had read within the last 48 hours in magazines, in newspapers, setting forth these prophecies by leaders of various sects and cults from every part of the world. The eyes of the world were on this pyramid. With all of this, we had a sense of satisfaction that we had been chosen as representatives by one of the very few and the largest of the occult mystical organizations who took the position that September 16th, 1936 was to see the fulfillment of a prophecy of the Great Pyramid, but instead of disaster and destruction and ruination, it was to be a constructive transition. It was to begin a change in business, in international outlook. And the AMORC, the Rosicrucian Order, to show its faith in its interpretation of the prophecy of the Great Pyramid, sent its representatives to be present in the very heart of it upon that day. There was no feeling of depression, but a feeling of elation, of intense excitement, like the minute of lull before a great storm when the boughs of trees are motionless, when not even a leaf can be seen to move, when all nature seems in suspense, waiting for a signal to release her fury. This suspense did not instill fear, but rather expectancy that something stupendous of a cosmic nature was taking place, or would shortly. It was then that there was performed a ceremony that none of us shall ever forget, and it was the first time that it had been performed since the days of the activity of the Great Pyramid itself, the time when the mystic brotherhoods held their regular ceremonies in it. This ceremony was the intonation of the mystic vibratory vowel sounds. Frater Brouwer stepped forward and turned so that his back was to the center of the great sarcophagus. The rest of us stood on either side of the chamber, and then he proceeded to intone these sacred vowel sounds, the vibrations of which have a definite effect upon the emotional and psychic natures of man. The vibrations, under ordinary circumstances, are intended to, and do, excite these centers of man's sympathetic nervous system and have a tendency to elevate his consciousness, to exhilarate him, lift him above the ordinary mundane feelings and sensations which he experiences daily. But none of us expected the result. We heard not alone Frater Brouwer's intonations, but it seemed the chorus of a million voices besides. With the very utterance of the first vowel, it seemed as though he had struck a key which unlocked voices that had been imprisoned in stone for centuries, awaiting a magic word or tone for release. And the sounds came back to us from the walls and the floor and the ceiling, like a chorus of cries of freedom, as though we had liberated imprisoned beings. It was startling. He continued the vowel sounds for a period of at least 5 minutes. We seemed to sway. We lost sense of time and space. We were swept along with this strange current of psychic emotionalism, and it seemed for several minutes, it must have been just seconds after he ceased his intonation, the sounds continued to reverberate from wall, ceiling and floor. Then all was quiet. The silence was deeper by contrast than it had been before. We felt rejuvenated. Fatigue from the ascent was gone. Any fear that any of us may have had with respect to the stories of what was to occur in the Great Pyramid seemed absurd to us now. We felt secure, and a sense of contentment and peace came over us, as though, unwittingly, we had accomplished a great good, which we may come to realize in this lifetime, or we may not. Our guide was waiting for us outside the low circular passageway. As we started through it, he begged me to stop in the middle of the passageway in my crouched position until he crawled through, reaching me. We could not pass each other. He looked into my face from his position on his hands and knees and said, "At this particular point where you are, you can safely arise and stand erect. I twisted my head into a position so that I could look above, and there, to my surprise, immediately above me was a small shaft just large enough to accommodate my body. I moved into a position so that as I arose, the upper portion of my body would rise into the shaft overhead. It was inky black because I could not then see the light of the circular passageway in which I stood. He said, "Reach above you with your right hand as far as you can." I brought my right hand up close to my body until I eventually stretched it far above my head. He said, "Now place your hand against the stone wall immediately in front of you." This I did. He continued, "Now, move your hand until you feel a projection of stone about the size of your hand." I moved my hand slowly against the cold, smooth stone surface until it struck against an oblong projection. He said, "Place your hand upon it." I did. I noticed that it fitted my hand as though it had been shaped to be held in a closed hand, like something that was intended to be carried by the hand. I pulled against it to see if it was loose. I commented on this. He explained, "What you feel has been shaped out of the stone block of which it is a part. The block has been cut away from the raised portion. Your hand now rests on the exact center of the Great Pyramid. It is the mathematical center. The distance from the point of your hand to the apex of the pyramid and to the base and to the various sides is exactly the same. Furthermore, you are now grasping what is known as the pyramidal inch. That stone, that particular size, was the unit of measurement used by the Egyptians in building this very edifice. And to commemorate that unit of measurement, it was carved on the side of one of the blocks of the pyramid and placed in the exact center where it now rests. What master mathematicians, what genius in a time and an age when the world likes to think of mankind having dwelt in utter ignorance. With a feeling akin to reverence, I rejoined the party, and soon we had left the coolness of the Great Pyramid with its constant temperature of 68 degrees Fahrenheit for the now blistering desert outside. The party then returned to Cairo, with the exception of Frater Brouwer and myself. We proceeded to locate one of the huge exterior blocks of stone of the pyramid in the shade, and there we sat and ate our lunch overlooking the plateau of the Sahara Desert and the green Nile and Delta, also looking down toward the mud huts on the site of the old city of Gizeh. Early in the afternoon, we sought out the recent excavations of that eminent archaeologist, Selim Hassan. We climbed down and through the Pyramid Temple. This temple was quite some distance from the Great Pyramid itself and originally was connected with it by a long ramp or causeway. Many preliminary ceremonies were held in this temple, and then from there the participants, candidates and neophytes, in a picturesque procession, walked along these ramps and causeways to the Great Pyramid and concluded their rites. Just recently, in this Pyramid Temple, there was excavated the sarcophagus and mummy of a princess, a daughter of Cheops. We photographed hundreds of feet of film of the more recent excavations of the Sphinx, showing how the paws were not hewn out of masonry as the upper portion of the body, but consisted of flat stones of about 4 inches in thickness, laid one upon the other, forming layers, and then shaped as we now see them. We commented upon the great crime committed by Napoleon when he ordered his men to fire upon the Sphinx, defacing it to show his disrespect for the Egyptians' veneration of it. After filming with professional cameras by special permission many other structures in and around the Great Pyramid, we went closer to examine and photograph with still camera the colonnaded court or entrance to a newly excavated temple at the base of the pyramid. Of a different type stone than the pyramid itself, it seemed marble-like against the background. We commented upon the fact that this very ancient structure had Doric-like columns, the architectural form credited to the much later Grecian period. We were to discover, however, that the Egyptians used this type of column quite commonly, and it is still believed by archaeologists that there is no connection between the Doric column and the column to which we have referred. It was late in the day as we prepared for our return. We departed by camel to a point where we could again load our equipment in a modern motorcar. We looked up at the Great Pyramid. It had changed. It was now colorful. The setting sun had given it a golden glow. Its ragged contour, caused by the exposed blocks of masonry, cast patches of deep shadow, purple in hue. The shadows seemed to be creeping up from the desert itself, rapidly approaching, soon to engulf it in darkness. We retired to our hotel early, for tomorrow the Nile was to reveal another chapter of civilization's tale. Each mile, almost, as one travels along that great river, one has unfolded to him a story of man's past accomplishments, glory, power, failure, hopes and misfortunes. Therefore we now looked forward to Luxor, or the ancient city of Thebes, once glorious capital of Egypt, when in all her power and splendor. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe and comment, and if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.